Okay. So again, thank you everybody for being here. We're very happy to have you join us for this webinar series. My name is Christelle Guédot. I'm the fruit crop entomologist and extension specialist and associate professor in the Department of Entomology at UW-Madison. And this is a webinar series for berry growers that's organized by both the University of Wisconsin and the University of Minnesota Extension. And we're very happy to host today our guest speaker, Patrick Byers, who is a commercial horticulture field specialist with the University of Missouri Extension. He's serving 9 counties in Southwest Missouri. His educational background includes horticulture degrees from the University of Nebraska, Missouri, and Arkansas. Patrick's 33-year career has touched all aspects of horticulture, and his current job focuses on advertisement to fruit and vegetable farmers with the goal of supporting sustainability and profitability. His passion includes berries, and we're so happy that he's going to talk to us about elderberries because that's a big one for him. He's very passionate about them. Garlic, native fruits and nuts, hops, and orchids. So I will not introduce elderberry. I will just let you go, Patrick, and go ahead with your talk. I will stop sharing my screen right now. I want to remind, while you do that, sorry, I want to remind everybody that during the webinar, we ask everybody to be muted and make sure that if they have any questions during the talk, to please just put them in the chat. It's easier in the chat. If you choose the Q&A, that's fine. We'll find them as well. But use the chat, put your questions there. And then at the end of the talk, we'll just read your questions. And then at that point, you can unmute yourself and ask your questions. And without further ado, please go ahead, Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Christelle. And I want to thank you and our other hosts for the invitation to be with you today to talk about elderberries. And as you mentioned in your introduction, I am indeed passionate about elderberries, both personally and professionally. And I think we're going to have a good time over the next 40, 50, 60 minutes or so. Now, a bit about my background. I've worked for University of Missouri Extension as a commercial horticulture field specialist for 14 years. And prior to that, I spent 18 years at the Missouri State Fruit Experiment Station. And at both of those facilities, I had the pleasure of working with elderberry. Now, elderberry is a new crop for us in Missouri. And when our project began in 1997, we could not identify any commercial scale production of elderberry. There were backyard plants and people harvested a considerable amount of fruit from wild plants, but there was no organized commercial elderberry industry. And if we fast forward 20 plus years to today, we now have somewhere between 300 and 400 acres of commercial elderberries in Missouri and the surrounding states. So it's been very interesting and very professionally gratifying to see how the industry has grown. Our program is focused on all aspects of American elderberry. We have a program to develop improved cultivars. To date, it's been focused on identifying superior wild plants, testing them, and then bringing them into cultivation. But starting this year, we're actually beginning an organized breeding program with American elderberry. So that's a very exciting development. We've also looked at elderberry production practices with focused efforts on pruning, fertilization, understanding and managing the pest complex, and looking at things such as leaf nutrient levels and post-harvest considerations. And again, moving ahead, we have several exciting initiatives beginning this year with elderberry in addition to our breeding program. So what I'd like to do over the next few minutes that we have together is to talk about American elderberry from a commercial production standpoint. But I think that if there are folks on the webinar today who are looking at home elderberry production, or if you're just plain interested in elderberry, you'll find some material that will definitely pique your interest. We'll talk first about elderberry productivity. Then we'll talk about how to select cultivars, and we'll talk a bit about which ones might be suitable for a more northern growing areas such as Minnesota and Wisconsin. We'll talk about environmental issues as far as growing the crop. We'll talk about site selection, cultural practices and productivity, pest management, and harvest management. And again, as was mentioned, I would welcome any questions that arise in the course of our presentation. So the first thing to think about is elderberry in a botanical sense. And the American elderberry is a type of elderberry that's found in in Eastern North America. And it's an amazingly adaptive species of plant. It's found all the way from the Gulf Coast to well into Canada and from the Eastern Seaboard to the Rocky Mountains as far as its original native range. Now, botanically speaking, American elderberry is considered to be a subspecies of a larger group of elderberries that are designated as Sambucus nigra. Now, Sambucus nigra is in itself the European or black elderberry, and then there are two subspecies, the American elderberry, Sambucus nigra canadensis, and the blue elderberry. And the blue elderberry is actually a Sambucus species found in the western US. And I've seen just lovely, lovely blue elderberries along the Pacific coast, but I've also seen them inland in Utah and Washington and Nevada. So it too has an interesting range. We are just beginning our investigation of blue elderberry in the Midwest. I understand there's some research and development going on with blue elderberry at several universities in the western states. But for today, we're going to be focused on American elderberry, which is Sambucus nigra canadensis. So the American elderberry is a large shrub or a small tree. And you'll notice that I actually have two Latin names listed there. There's just a lot of controversy, if you want to call it that, among the botanical community as far as the relationship among many different plants. And now that we're looking at plants at the DNA level, some of these relationships are becoming clear. And it does seem that the designation of American elderberry as a subspecies of European elderberry is likely an accurate way to describe it, but there are still those purists out there who want to call it a separate species, Sambucus canadensis. At any rate, it's found across Eastern North America. The plant is a woody plant. It will persist as a woody plant. It also will annually send up new shoots from its crown or its root system. And if we look at the growth habit of the American elderberry, that upper picture shows what they look like in native stands. And easy to identify American elderberry when it's flowering in June because of the lovely, lovely white blossoms. The blossoms are in a flattened form. And then, of course, as the berries set and develop, harvest season is going to be later in the year, typically in late July and August. And they'll develop these beautiful clusters of dark purple berries. The woody parts of the plant are characterized by these raised bumps or lenticels, as you see in the lower left picture. And the foliage is pinnately compound. You have a central stalk on the leaf, and then you have the leaflets coming off of it. And American elderberry typically has somewhere between 7 to 9 leaflets. Now, why are we interested in American elderberry? Well, you know, if nothing else has come out of the pandemic situation over the past 2+ years, it's been an interest in elderberry. And I could tell you stories about the sales patterns on elderberry products and the fact that, you know, the domestic elderberry supply was very quickly exhausted early in the pandemic, and there was just no product available to make these various health supplements. But it is of growing commercial interest. Now, the historic uses of elderberry were for products like jelly and jam. And more recently, we've seen elderberry used in wines and spirits and other drinks. The big growth industry at present with elderberry is as health supplements. And there are a number of different ways that elderberry is used in health supplements. An emerging market for us in the Midwest is the flower market. And if you look at elderberry on an international scale, particularly if you look at European production of European elderberry, a good portion of that crop is actually focused on flower harvest and the production of flower products. We're not there yet with American elderberry, but we've done some preliminary research in our project to look at the effects, for example, of harvesting flowers on the fruit yield. And we feel that we can comfortably say that we can harvest a portion of the flower crop, perhaps as much as 15 to 20%, without affecting the yield of berries. So there may be the opportunity for farmers to see two products from an elderberry planting, both flowers and fruit. Elderberry has also been used widely as a food colorant. In fact, in Europe, this is one of the primary uses of elderberry. It's a stable food colorant, a dark red or purple food colorant. for lower pH products. And so it's widely used as a natural food colorant. And there may be interest in using other plant parts. We've done some investigative work to look at bioactive compounds in things such as the foliage and the blossoms and other parts of the elderberry plant. But at the moment, the focus is on health supplements. Now, when we think about cultivars, there's just a handful of improved elderberry cultivars. And even with these improved cultivars in place, a portion of the elderberry crop that is harvested each year is harvested from wild plants. But there is interest in developing improved elderberries. And the reasons are pretty clear. You know, if the goal is to produce a health supplement, for example, that is of uniform quality, we have to have uniform berries, uniform raw material going into these products. And when you harvest fruit from wild plants, there's a lot of diversity in juice components and other things that affect the quality of finished products. And so at the moment, the focus now is on developing elderberries that are suitable for production here in the Midwest. And what we're interested in is plant characteristics. We would like to have upright plants, but we don't want them to be too tall. We want them to be easy to manage. We also want plants that will readily grow back when they're cut back to the ground. We'll see in a moment why this approach is used for elderberries. Adaptation is great. We would like to have elderberry cultivars that are widely adapted. And at the moment, we have several cultivars that do have pretty wide adaptation. You know, there are northern and southern limits for every cultivar, but the cultivars developed in Missouri tend to do well up into the upper Midwest. So states like Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota would be suitable for growing the cultivars developed here. And certainly the cultivars developed in Canada would be well suited for Minnesota and Wisconsin. Pollination issues. Work at the University of Missouri has demonstrated that elderberry will set fruit best if you allow for cross-pollination. So having more than one cultivar in a planting is very helpful. There is some evidence, though, that elderberry, under some circumstances, can be self-fertile. And so the hope here is that we should be able to identify cultivars that could be self-fertile, but we're not there yet. Obviously, yield is important, so is pest resistance, and so is cultivars that grow fruit for intended use. You know, for example, there's some interest in using elderberry as a dessert berry. And in that case, having large individual berry size would be desirable. Those elderberries that are being used in health supplements, it's great if those have a high natural content of bioactive compounds. We also have noticed some differences in growth habit. And for want of a better word, we have some types that we call determinate types. And if we look at this picture here, we can see elderberries that when they're cut back to the ground will grow shoots out that are capped with a single large cluster of blossoms and fruit. And having this type of a flowering and fruit production habit gives us a very uniform crop. It's efficient to harvest and manage. And so we feel there's a place for cultivars that have this type of a growth habit. But we also have cultivars in our project that have what we are calling an indeterminate growth habit, where yes, we do have that large center flower and fruit cluster, but there's also side shoots produced that produce a later crop of blossoms and fruit. And particularly if the goal is to grow a elderberry planting for both fruit and blossoms, this type of a growth habit is desirable because the side blossoms can be harvested for a flower harvest without significantly affecting the yield of the plant. Okay, before we leave the idea of cultivars, there are a number of cultivars developed in the University of Missouri program. And these are named in honor of the people who have provided them to our project. And at present, we have 4 cultivars that we're interested in. These are the cultivars Bob Gordon, Wildwood, Ranch, and Pocahontas. And these are the cultivars that the industry is presently growing. We're always interested in new and better elderberries. And we always, again, as plant breeders, we're always hopeful for the future. And I would encourage anyone who is with us today, if you identify wild elderberries in the course of your time with elderberries that you feel might be superior or might have potential, please send us some cuttings, and we'd love to evaluate them in our project alongside our established cultivars. Now, environmental issues. When we think about the commercial production of elderberry, it's the case with all berries that you have to look carefully at the adaptation of cultivars to particular types of environment. And in the case of elderberry, it doesn't flower early, so we're not particularly concerned about frost damage, but we are concerned about damage to the emerging shoots. So, even though it's not flowering early, it is still vulnerable to late freezes. We've also seen issues related to excess rain, which negatively impacts pollination. Hail, of course, is damaging to any fruit crop. And then there are issues related to high temperatures, particularly as the berries enter the ripening phase. And so we definitely are interested in cultivars that can tolerate high temperatures. Okay, now let's turn our attention to site selection. Elderberries do best in full sun settings and protected from high winds, especially, as we'll see here in a moment, if farmers are growing these plants by cutting them to the ground and essentially growing a new plant each year. The bush architecture has long stems with a single large cluster of berries at the top. And these long stems are vulnerable to breakage in high winds. In fact, we've seen some plantings that have been just devastated by high winds. And so if there is the option of planting an elderberry planting in a site where it's protected from wind, this is going to be helpful in reducing the breakage of those shoots. And then elderberries do best in a well-drained soil. Okay, so again, to visit cultivars, the original improved elderberry cultivar work was done in New York in 1926 with Adams 1 and Adams 2. And these two cultivars have more or less merged together over the years, and now it's just collectively called Adams. And Adams does have a place. It has performed reasonably well in our trials here and would be a cultivar to consider in more northern growing areas. But we feel that the cultivar York, which is a seedling of Adams 2, is actually superior to Adams. And so York would be the cultivar of choice if we were looking at these New York releases. I mentioned our Midwestern releases, Bob Gordon, Wildwood, Pocahontas, and I also mentioned Ranch. The cultivars developed here are characterized by large clusters of berries, medium to large berry size, and good quality in the fruit. They have been developed from wild elderberries growing in the Midwest, so they are adapted to our area. Now, one concern we have about these is, again, how far north can we take them? And there have been some trials with Missouri elderberries in Quebec that have not performed all that well because of a shorter growing season. Pocahontas, I just want to mention that this is our newest release, just lovely, lovely clusters of berries. A potential issue with Pocahontas, though, with these wonderful clusters of berries is that issue with stem breakage. Now, we are focused on American elderberry, but there is some interest in European elderberry, and we actually have one European elderberry cultivar that was developed in our program, and that's the cultivar Marge. And we recommend Marge if there is interest in the Midwest for European elderberry, because the others, Hochberg, for example, just have not performed well under our environmental conditions. So Marge might be one to consider if there is some interest in European elderberry. Now, turning our attention to growing elderberries. Elderberries are a joy to work with, especially if you've worked with some of the more difficult fruit crops, blueberries, for example. They're easy to propagate. Typically, dormant hardwood cuttings are used, and you can see a box full of dormant hardwood cuttings there in the lower picture. And these are collected in January or February before growth begins. Typically, they're 1, 2, or 3 nodes in length, generally 2 nodes in length. And you see my note there about rooting hormone. We typically don't use rooting hormone, but some growers have reported better rooting with the use of rooting hormone. These cuttings are then stuck in, they can be stuck actually immediately upon collecting, but typically they're held in refrigeration until March, and then they're stuck in March. And they can actually be stuck directly in the field where the orchard is going to be, or they can be started in pots or nursery beds and then transplanted to the field. In addition to dormant hardwood cuttings, root cuttings, sprouted hardwood cuttings, softwood cuttings, tissue culture, and seeds are all potential ways to propagate elderberries. And again, the typical ways with dormant hardwood cuttings, These are cuttings that are collected from plants that were cut back to the ground the previous spring or the previous winter. And in fact, our farmers tend to manage elderberries as an annually grown crop. We'll see this here in a moment. But if you do cut these things back to the ground, the shoots that grow the next growing season are perfect cutting material during the following winter. You can see they're long, unbranched, they're from the current season's growth, and they rip beautifully. And again, here we are sticking hardwood cuttings in a nursery bed, and you can also start them in pots or cell packs. Now, planting layout. If there's any concern about soil drainage, it's definitely beneficial to put them on a berm. And in fact, many of the most productive plantings in Missouri are on berms. Spacing between plants. In time, American elderberry will form a hedgerow if allowed to do that. We'll see here in a moment when we talk about weed control, there may be some reasons why you don't want a hedgerow, but typically the initial spacing is 3 to 4 feet between plants, and then about 10 to 12 feet between rows, depending on the type of equipment that you need to get down between the rows. This is a picture of the first year cuttings that were stuck into the field. And in this case, the farmer was using mulch to help manage weeds on the berm. You can also establish plantings from plants. And again, these could be rooted cuttings from pots, or they could even be year-old plants in pots. And this works quite well too. But the typical way in Missouri to establish elderberries is to stick cuttings into the soil in the planting field. And if you do a good job of preparing the site and you have a soil that is loose and well-drained yet moisture retentive, you can expect somewhere between 80 to 90% success with direct field sticking of the cuttings. Most farmers will purchase, about 15 to 20% more cuttings than they need, and then root the excess in pots and then transplant them into field to fill in any skips. And here's an example of a newly established elderberry planting. This picture was taken towards the end of June from cuttings that were stuck in March. Okay, now let's talk a bit about some of the cultural practices with elderberry: pruning, fertility management, site management, and irrigation. So pruning, our farmers have embraced an approach to pruning that they call annual renewal. And you can see here the crew is cutting these plants back all the way to the ground. This is typically done in January. And the result is plants that grow up as single unbranched shoots from the root system the following spring. And they will typically have a large flower and fruit cluster on the top of each of those shoots. Now, depending on the growth habit, they may have those side shoots that I mentioned that also blossom. But what this approach does is it gives the farmer a concentrated ripening period, which makes harvest much more efficient. Elderberries are hand harvested in Missouri, and it's actually the most expensive aspect of growing elderberries. And so anything that farmers can do to make harvest more efficient is of interest. We also see some benefits from the standpoint of pest management, in particular aerified mites, which they're tiny mites that feed on the plant juices early in the growing season, and they inject a toxin which causes leaf distortion and can actually cause the abortion of the flower heads. These mites, again, based on Dr. Warman's work, appear to overwinter at the tips of shoots. And if we cut the plants back annually and remove the wood from the orchard, we tend to have greatly reduced damage from aerified mites. Now, the question, will this work in northern growing areas? This approach has been tried in Quebec and it did not work. Again, there is a northern limit from the standpoint of the length of the growing season to be able to carry this out, because these plants will flower later and crop later than plants on unpruned bushes. We are working diligently to understand fertility management with elderberry. And our preliminary work with nitrogen fertilization suggests that a mature bearing blueberry planting will require about 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And we've seen benefits injecting this over the course of the season or using split applications. But elderberries are heavy feeders, and especially in plantings where the bushes are cut back to the ground and annually renewed, you remove a lot of nutrient store when you cut the plant back. and that has to be then provided in the form of applied nitrogen. Other nutrients, we feel that the need for nutrients such as phosphorus and potassium initially would be similar to other berries like blackberries, but there will be an ongoing need for these nutrients again as you continuously remove the upper part of the shrub. Foliar sampling. So we have work underway to help understand the benefit of foliar sampling. We've done work, for example, looking at sampling at 2 different times during the growth cycle, early in the season and then just as the crop begins to ripen, and compared nutrient levels found in what we would consider to be healthy elderberry plants to plants that seem to be showing nutritional deficiencies. And this work is still very much a work in progress, and hopefully we'll be able to have understand better what sufficiency levels would be for elderberry. We have this information for most of the other berry crops. We just need to generate it for elderberry so that foliar sampling can become a useful tool for farmers to understand their nutrient status of their plants. Elderberries in Missouri must be irrigated, and they're definitely not drought tolerant plants, and especially if they're growing on a berm, that raised portion of their root zone tends to dry out quickly. They do need to have irrigation. Our farmers tend to use an approach similar to other berries like blueberries or blackberries, an 18 millimeter tube as we see in this photo that has inline emitters, molded in emitters about every 18 to 24 inches. And as far as the water needs for elderberry, we're looking at this as well in the course of our research. But what we've learned to date suggests that standard recommendation for berries of 1.5 to 2 inches per week should work pretty well for elderberry. Now, some thoughts on pest management. I mentioned areophide mites earlier, and here we see a picture showing the effects of a heavy areophide mite infestation. And you can see that we've lost a good portion of the blossoms and fruit on this particular flower cluster. And if you look down, you can see the distorted leaves on the plant as a result of the mite feeding. For areophide mites, we typically, again, are recommending the removal of all pruned parts of the elderberry plant. There may be some benefit to using a dormant application of liquid lime sulfur. We have farmers who have tried that. We have not investigated it in the course of our research, but it definitely is something that warrants some research. Spotted-winged Drosophila is a serious issue on many elderberry plantings in Missouri. The only recourse at present for spotted-winged Drosophila is to use insecticide applications close to harvest. This, of course, is a dilemma for our organic growers who really only have one effective insecticide that is an organic insecticide. Japanese beetle can be an issue. Our farmers address Japanese beetle with insecticide applications, or in the case of organic orchards, using a push-pull trapping strategy to use baited traps, baited with lures that then trap the Japanese beetles. We occasionally see other insect issues with sawfly or the elderberry borer. Those tend to be sporadic, and we don't feel them to be as serious a concern as the first 3 that I mentioned. An elderberry disease of concern is elderberry rust, and this causes, in a heavy infestation, causes the bending and the twisting and the deformation of fruit cluster stems, leaf stems, and the growing shoots of elderberry. And it can definitely impact productivity if the infestation is heavy enough. We have work underway looking at other elderberry diseases, but elderberry rust is the primary disease of interest. And we're just beginning work now looking at the virus situation with elderberries. So we really don't know much about this, but hopefully after 2 to 3 years of study, we'll understand the virus complex in elderberries better. And then birds. Birds will sometimes feed on elderberries. We have not seen them to be a major pest like they are on blueberries or some grapes, but they can be a problem on elderberries. And one thing that we've noticed is that elderberry cultivars, where the berries, when they ripe, sort of drop into a sort of a pendulous or hanging type habit, are less likely to be eaten by birds than the cultivars that have elderberry clusters that are very upright. And I've watched finches, for example, and they will perch on those upright cultivars underneath the berries and actually just eat their way around the cluster. whereas they don't seem to bother those cultivars where the berries are hung in a sort of a pendulous fashion. Again, some more pictures. You can see clearly here the damage due to eriophyte mites in this shot. Spotted wing Drosophila, which, it's a problem berry wide, but it's, as I mentioned, it is an issue on elderberry as well. Japanese beetle. Elderberry is actually a favored host for Japanese beetle. And so if you're growing elderberry and you have Japanese beetle present in your area, you definitely want to be scouting for this particular pest. And I mentioned there are some other insects as well, the sawfly, the elder borer, and then the spindle worm too. Here is elderberry rust. And again, notice the orange growth area. That's the symptom and sign of elderberry rust on elderberry. It's an interesting disease. It requires a secondary host. And in the case of elderberry rust, it's one of at least 7 species of sedges. And we've seen some benefit in managing elderberry rust. Sedges tend to be found in moist areas. And if these areas are kept mowed, if they're adjacent to an elderberry planting, we tend to see fewer issues with elderberry rust. As I mentioned, there are other diseases as well. This is a a bacterial leaf spot that we occasionally see on elderberry in Missouri. And then we do see virus issues. Here's a shot of an elderberry that seems to be infested with viruses. Birds, some farmers have tried netting to manage birds, and the upper picture shows a netted planting, but the lower picture, again, shows elderberry with that pendulous growth habit that I mentioned that is less attractive to birds. Our general thoughts on pest management, that final bullet there, routine spray schedule, I think with the presence of spotted wing Drosophila that we are at a point where we have to have routine sprays on elderberries. But these other IPM strategies are important as well. Again, the removal of woody stems after pruning, the dormant applications of oil and perhaps liquid lime sulfur. Scouting is very important for spotted wing Drosophila and Japanese beetle. And then it's important from the standpoint of managing spotted wing Drosophila to remove all fruit from the planting during the harvest period. Now some thoughts on weed management. Elderberries, as time goes by, obviously as a perennial woody plant, the weed spectrum tends to mimic the characteristics of the plant. And what we end up having is serious issues with perennial woody weeds among a perennial woody plant like elderberry. And in Missouri, these weeds include poison ivy and Virginia creeper and wild grapes and mulberries, wild cherries, red cedar. These are all plants that the seeds are dispersed by birds. And birds, of course, can be an issue in elderberry plantings, not just eating the elderberries, but also leaving the seeds of these woody weeds behind. In the past, we grew elderberries in a setting where we were expecting a hedgerow to form, and we used mulch along the edges. And almost invariably, these plantings ended up having issues with woody perennial weeds. Most of the recently planted elderberry plantings in Missouri are going in with some sort of protective ground cover around the bushes. The picture on the left shows woven landscape fabric or weed barrier placed around a planting. And this is expected to be in place for probably 10 years. That's the expected life on these types of fabrics. And it works quite well. With this approach, it's important to make a large enough hole where you plant the elderberry. And that hole typically needs to be about 18 inches in diameter. And in fact, I've been in plantings that, as time goes by, you have to actually enlarge an 18-inch hole. With this approach, of course, you're not going to generate a hedgerow, but we still see good productivity on these types of plantings. The picture on the lower right is actually a picture we saw earlier, but this is a young elderberry field where the initial site preparation was to make raised beds with plastic mulch, plastic film mulch, similar to what might be used in growing a tomato crop or a pepper crop. And then the elderberry cuttings are pushed through the plastic mulch and they root. And this mulch typically lasts about a year. And then once it's out of the way, then you start thinking about weed management. And this is helpful to get a young planting off the ground if you're not going to use the more permanent solution, which is the woven landscape fabric. Okay, now let's turn our attention to harvest management. And this is a really important time from the standpoint of growing elderberries. And recognizing that most elderberries that are grown in Missouri are going to go into a processed product, it's very important that these berries have the characteristics needed to make good processed products. So timing, harvest practices are important. Destemming and post-harvest handling are important as well. So with the interest in flower harvest, I thought I'd mention just a few things about blossom harvest. This happens in June in Missouri, and typically it's done when all the florets are open. If you look at this picture here, this large cluster, this is on Pocahontas, you'll notice that the majority of the florets are open. There's a few unopened florets in the very center of those clusters, and you can see them. They look like little white balls. And even though there are several that are not open, this would be the stage at which a farmer would harvest. These would be harvested in the morning. One of the important characteristics of these blossoms, these florets, is the fragrance. And the fragrance actually dissipates fairly quickly in the heat of the day. So flowers should be harvested early in the day. And then the florets can be removed from the stems by rubbing over a screen. And then at this point, they may be used immediately for something like a flower-enhanced energy drink. Perhaps they might be frozen for later use, or they could be dried for use in something like elderflower tea. Fruit harvest takes place in July and August. And what growers have done historically is to harvest when all of the berries are colored in the fruit cyme. And that upper picture, we can see a stage where they would be harvested. That lower picture is a selection that we had in our trial for a number of years, but we've discarded it because it did not uniformly ripen the fruit. Again, remember that elderberries are hand harvested, and we want to do everything we can to come up with efficient ways to deal with this expensive part of growing the crop. And one way to do that is to have all the berries ripen at the same time. So with a single clip, you can harvest that entire fruit head. If there are unripe berries mixed among the ripe berries, to some degree, they can be removed. But if they remain in the berries, they will actually give negative characteristics, negative qualities to processed products. So this is not something that we want to see in the berries after harvest. Usually 2 to 3 pickings are needed to harvest the entire crop off of a plant that was cut back to the ground the previous winter. Now, that's the historic way of doing it. And what we've been advocating in more recent years is to look at juice chemistry as a criteria for when to harvest elderberry. And again, this is not news. Wine grape growers have been using this approach for decades, probably even centuries. And we need to be moving in this direction with elderberries as well. Yes, berry color is an important visual cue that it's time to harvest. We should be looking, though, at juice chemistry. And the two characteristics that farmers are using is total soluble solids and juice pH. And those are both fairly easy to measure. Total soluble solids, I'm using a refractometer for that. All it requires is a representative sample and juice extracted from that, and then a look at what the sugar level is. And juice pH, same thing. You can use the same sample and then use a pH meter to give an accurate reading of juice chemistry. So here, this is actually at the Mountain Grove Research Farm where we're harvesting an elderberry crop. Now, once the berries are harvested, the fruit is typically destemmed. And destemming is the removal of the main stem, but also as much of the small stems that connect the berries to the main cluster. The reason this is done is that the stems will impart negative aspects to processed products as well. And in our work, after destemming is done, about 4 to 10% of the fresh weight is actually stem. On a commercial scale, berries are typically destemmed as fresh berries. Smaller scale, you can actually freeze the berries on the stems and then destem the frozen berries and actually get a little bit cleaner product going that approach. But most farmers will destem berries when they're freshly harvested. If you have to hold the berries before destemming, it should be done at about 32 to 34 degrees. But really, it's better to destem as soon as possible after harvest, because if the berries desiccate, if they dry out any and the clusters start to wilt, they're much harder to effectively destem. Once they're destemmed, the fruit is typically washed and sanitized. And farmers are using several things to sanitize with, but typically it's going to be a chlorine-based sanitizer that's labeled for contact with fruits and vegetables. And then once the berries are destemmed, they can be stored for a short period of time as fresh berries at about 4 degrees C. But the majority of berries at this stage will then be frozen. And they can be held at minus 20 degrees for 2 years or perhaps even more without any loss of quality. And farmers that are growing elderberry in quantity typically will harvest berries, freeze them, and then sell them as the market demands them. Now, in 2020, the first COVID year, with such a demand for elderberry products, the stored harvest of elderberry from 2019 was pretty much gone by July and August of 2020. And this is unusual. Typically, there's about a year's supply of berries held in storage, but there were no berries to be had after mid-2020. The destemming can be accomplished in several ways. A common way is to use a grape destemmer, which is what we see here, that has the cylinder, where I'm poking my finger through, has holes in it that have the edges sharpened. And when you have a cylinder with holes about this size, it works quite well for destemming elderberries. There's also other types of destemmers. This particular destemmer has 2 screens that move in opposite directions, and they shear the berries off, which then drop into the container underneath the destemmer. And I have a video here embedded. We'll see if it works. And I'll warn you in advance, the sound is a little bit loud, so you might put your finger close to your volume control if this actually works. So let's see if we can get this to play. Well, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to play it, but it was actually a demonstration of that destemmer that we saw just in the previous slide. Now, what about the value of the elderberry crop? Well, it can be sold on the stem. It could also be sold destemmed. Typically, our farmers are selling destemmed berries, and the historic price has been around somewhere between $2 and $3 per pound, which in my opinion, is on the low side because production costs are actually going to approach that $2 figure. But in 2020 and 2021, again, with the increased demand for berries, the price jumped to $5 per pound, which, again, in my opinion, is actually closer to what it really should be. Berries on the stem sell anywhere from 50 cents to $1.95 per pound. We are seeing some interest, as I mentioned, in marketing blossoms. At present, there's not a clear picture as far as the value of blossoms, but I have seen dried elderberry blossoms sold for around $25 a pound. So that might be a starting point for discussion with a processor in marketing an elderflower crop. So that's a quick look at elderberries. I will mention that our research group has produced a publication called Growing and Marketing Elderberries in Missouri that's available as a free downloadable PDF. We also have a market survey of elderberries report that is available as well. A number of videos have been produced by our team that are again, easy to find with a Google search for Missouri elderberries, and check those out. If we'd had more time today, I have a video that I would have played that basically walks a prospective elderberry grower through all the steps of growing and marketing elderberries. So check that video out. Here's my contact information. Please feel free to email me or reach out with a phone call if you'd like to talk elderberries. I'm happy to talk to anyone about elderberries. So again, at this point, I think I'll go ahead and stop share. And Josie and Christelle, I guess at this point, we can tackle questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. That was so informative and such a great overview of all the different aspects that people might face if they started growing elderberry, and also for people that are more advanced, potentially learning new things, of course. So that was great. That was very encompassing and very enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have some questions in the chat. So the first question is late fall planting of cuttings successful?
Well, we've not tried late fall planting of cuttings. I have tried softwood and semi-hardwood cuttings late in the season, ridding them under a mist system with ridding hormone, and have had success with that. But typically we're going to wait to stick cuttings till in the spring, when we have a long growth period ahead of them to get those cuttings rooted and growing. I don't know how much root growth you would be able to generate with sticking cuttings late in the growing season.
Thank you. And thank you, Sonia, for your question. John has a question. He mentions that last year was a very dry year for us and our first year plantings didn't take off very well. Will they recover this year? These plantings were about 12-inch tall when placed in the ground early spring and only reached about 24 inches by the end of the season.
I think they will. Elderberry is a tough, resilient plant. Just to share a personal story, my dad grew up as a farm boy in Iowa, and his time on the farm was before herbicides were available, and one of the most difficult weeds they had to manage in their fields were elderberries because nothing would kill them, and they were so persistent. But yes, it's a resilient plant, so I would definitely give it another chance. Now, if you can figure out a way to keep them uniformly moist, that would be very helpful. And even on a young planting, don't neglect fertilization.
Thank you. Scott is asking, what is the row spacing within and between?
Our plantings are typically 10 to 12 feet apart. I think they could be a bit closer, but generally farmers need that much space to get their tractor and their mower down between the rows. Within the row, if your goal is to grow a hedgerow, you could actually start off with cuttings planted very closely together and generate a hedgerow very quickly. But from the standpoint of the economics of establishing a planting, most farmers are planting cuttings 3 to 4 feet apart. If you're going to grow these plants as individual plants using weed barrier fabric, then the typical spacing is 3 to 4 feet.
Okay, thank you. Jim is wondering, for a hobbyist, how many plants are needed for pollination?
For a hobbyist, I think 2 plants are all you need, as long as they're different cultivars or from different wild plants. An elderberry plant in our trials, the most productive elderberry plants might produce somewhere between 10 to 15 pounds of berries. So even just a few plants can give you enough berries to have fun with.
Yeah, you just have to pay attention to cross pollination, hence the different cultivars that you were mentioning, Patrick, right?
Yes.
Yeah. What is the minimum water need?
Well, as far as minimum water need, you really have to look at other extenuating circumstances. Are you having a dry spell in the middle of the summer where it's hot and windy, or is this dry spell coming early in the season? Are the elderberry plants sizing up the berries and you're getting close to harvest? Then you'll need more water than, say, early in the season or after harvest. But as a rule of thumb, we generally use 1.5 to 2 inches of water per week as a good guideline for irrigating elderberries.
Great. What's the furthest zone north that can one use annual pruning?
Yeah, that's a question that we haven't answered conclusively. I can tell you that we've had collaborators who've tried annual renewal pruning in Quebec and Maine, and it has not worked. So, those are pretty far north, right? We have had successful use of this approach across Missouri and certainly in southern Iowa and central Illinois. How far north we can carry that approach, I really don't know. And I must mention, too, that not all elderberries perform equally well with this approach. The cultivars in our program have done well, but especially if you were trying a wild elderberry from your area or some other cultivar, you might want to give it a try for a year or two on a trial basis, just to see.
Okay, thank you. Jean is asking, do deer eat elderberry?
Yes, indeed. Deer can be a major issue. Mm-hmm. It's primarily browsing damage with elderberry, but yes, deer can be a problem.
Sonia is asking, would a simple trellis support be worthwhile to prevent lodging from wind?
I think with a cultivar like Pocahontas, where we know that's going to be an issue, and especially at a windy site, then there might be some benefit. Perhaps, having posts and a wire where the shoots can be tied to. But in general, that's an expense that most of our farmers don't want to invest in.
Okay. Are bees needed for pollination?
So bees will avidly visit elderflowers, and we feel that insect pollination is important. There also seems to be a contribution of wind pollination as well. So likely a combination of both. But yes, bees, and not just bees, but many other insects. Elderberry, American elderberry is a fabulous plant to put into habitat rows and pollinator plantings because it doesn't produce much in the way of nectar, but it produces an abundant pollen crop. And we've identified many, many different types of native bees and other insects visiting the elder flowers. Not only that, they also visit what are called nectaries that are found on elderberries. And these they secrete a sweet substance. They're like little glands near where the leaves attach to the stem. And a number of insects visit those as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure flies do really well on elderberries with the shape of the flowers. Yes. And those are good pollinators as well. Our last question in the chat right now is from Tom. What would be your concerns for planting elderberry in a perennial polyculture row?
I think they're excellent candidates for perennial polyculture. I think the main thing to think about, typically in perennial polycultures, you have some taller plants and then you have plants of lower stature, and you want to be sure that you arrange these plants in such a way that you can maintain that sun exposure that elderberries need. They're not particularly productive or even happy under the canopy of trees, but if they can get sunlight, they will grow, in the company of many other plants.
Okay, so I'm launching a poll right now while people can continue to enter their questions in the chat. And this is a poll really for you to let us know how this webinar, how helpful it was for you. And there's a couple questions, just 4 questions total. So if you could please answer those questions. Okay, I was a little surprised I wasn't seeing any participation, but yes, please enter the survey while we keep talking. I had a question for you while people do that. Patrick, you mentioned Japanese beetle and you mentioned a push-pull strategy. Is it something that people would use the monitoring traps that you can purchase commercially? Is that how people are using this kind of mass trapping strategy?
Well, research work at Lincoln University has demonstrated the utility of this approach. And typically, we're not using the monitoring traps. We're using much larger reservoirs to catch the beetles. Frequently using a 55-gallon drum or a long nylon sock.
Yep, I've seen that.
And then we're using lures that are, the more potent lures, the ones that last longer and actually draw beetles in from a further distance. And it's important, if you're going to use this approach, that you establish a perimeter around the planting, where you have the traps at regular intervals. You don't want to attract more beetles into the planting. What you want to do is intercept them as they come in and draw them out of the planting.
Yeah. So yeah, a mass trapping. So you have to be very careful with where you're placing those so that they don't bypass. Yeah. And
you wouldn't want the traps in the planting. You want them on the perimeter.
No, you want them on the perimeter and try, like you said, to intercept them as they're coming in. I think people are still, please try to answer the survey as you're listening. I have another question here. Any recommendation for simple 20 to 50 cuttings, male or deer-like jungs, or just a helpful neighbor?
So where can you source cuttings? There are several nurseries that have embraced elderberry. As far as finding a cutting source, that can be a bit trickier. But if you're looking for plants, a nursery such as Indiana Berry Company or Norse Farm or Forest Keeling Nursery in Missouri, these are all good sources. If you're looking for cuttings, then you might consider River Hills or in Missouri, or Elder Farm in Missouri. They are good cutting sources.
Thank you. I am posting now, sharing my screen with the follow-up seminars that we're going to have for this webinar series. So we're going to have on February 17th, Jason Fishback will come and talk to us about hazelnuts. On March 10th, we have our speaker talking about currants. And on March 31st, we'll have our next speaker talking about honeyberries. So we have a pretty well-rounded series of webinars. And we're so happy, Patrick, that you were able to kick us off with elderberry. I think that's super interesting, very good information. In the meantime, I will also provide here, and please continue to ask questions. There's links here where people can go and find the recordings. So you can go, if you signed up for the webinar on the Wisconsin Food News website, where the webinar was, where the place to register was, will turn into the recording. But you can also go to the YouTube link that I posted first on the Wisconsin fruit. You can also go to that same place for registering for more webinars on the link below, the fruit.wisc.edu/webinars. And if you're from Minnesota, you can also go back to your University of Minnesota Small Farms YouTube channel, and that will be also posted there. There's another question from Dennis, and that'll probably be our last question. What insecticide would you recommend for spray control of Japanese beetle?
Well, there are a number of insecticides that are labeled for Japanese beetle on berry crops, including elderberries. I think that as far as the choices that our farmers make, if they are conventional growers, they might use a synthetic pyrethroid, such as Mustang Max. There also is some use of malathion, but that's trickier because it's so harmful to beneficials and honeybees. There's also some interest in some of the other alternative chemistries. Now, if you're an organic farmer, unfortunately, your spectrum is much more limited. Pyganic is not particularly helpful against Japanese beetle. It does have some repellent effect. The spinosad type sprays are not helpful against Japanese beetle. They are helpful against spotted-winged Drosophila, but not Japanese beetles. So there's just not a lot available for organic growers.
Yeah, there's talks about neem oil potentially being a repellent for Japanese beetle, but I've never seen good results that were really showing that it worked, but that's a possibility. Another one that I've seen in grapes is, and now of course I won't think of the name, kaolin clay. Kaolin clay has been shown in grapes to be preventing Japanese beetle from feeding on the leaves in grapes. So it's something that people might want to consider, but the coverage is a big issue, of course, and reapplying and all that, but that's approved organically. So that's an option that people might want to try, especially if they have it for other food crops. I'm sure it's registered on elderberry, but I haven't checked. Well, thank you so much, Patrick. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Hopefully you will join us for our following webinars for berries, but we also have webinars for apple and grapes. And again, thank you so much, Patrick, for your time and your great presentation. It was a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure as well, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.